I showed up at my parents' house around 7 on that Tuesday evening in March. My mom answered the door and seemed happy to see me, asking if I wanted some leftover casserole. I told her I just needed to talk to both of them about something important. She called my dad in from the garage where he'd been working on some project. We all sat down in the living room, and I remember feeling weirdly formal about the whole thing. I had practiced what I was going to say, but now it felt awkward. I started by telling them how much Sarah meant to me and how I wanted to spend my life with her. My mom was smiling and nodding along, clearly figuring out where this was heading. Then I got to the actual request. I told my dad that I respected him and valued his opinion, and I wanted to ask for his blessing to marry Sarah. I expected him to maybe get emotional or shake my hand or something. Instead, his face went completely blank for a few seconds. Then something shifted in his expression. He looked angry, but not just angry, disgusted. He asked me to repeat what I had just said. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me clearly, so I said it again. I told him I was asking for his blessing to marry my girlfriend. That's when he exploded. He stood up so fast that his chair nearly tipped over. His face was red, and he was shaking. He started yelling about how I had some nerve coming into his house and asking him for anything. My mom looked completely shocked and kept asking what was wrong. My dad turned to look at my mom with this expression I'd never seen before. It was like pure hatred. He told her that she knew exactly what was wrong. Then he looked back at me and said I wasn't his son, that I was a bastard, and I needed to get out of his house immediately. I honestly thought he was having some kind of mental breakdown. I tried to calm him down and asked what he was talking about. That just made him angrier. He started screaming about how he'd been raising another man's kid for 26 years and how sick he was of looking at me. My mom was crying at this point and begging him to stop. She kept saying he was scaring her and that he needed to calm down. But he just kept going. He told me I was nothing to him and that I should go find my real father if I wanted a blessing. I was completely frozen. I couldn't process what he was saying. I kept asking him what he meant, but he just kept yelling at me to get out. Finally, my mom grabbed my arm and whispered that I should probably leave and let him cool down. I walked to my car in a complete daze. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I was backing out of the driveway, I could hear him still yelling inside the house. I had no idea what had just happened or why my dad had completely lost his mind. I drove around for about an hour before I finally went home to my apartment. I kept replaying the whole scene in my head, trying to figure out what had triggered such an insane reaction. Maybe he was stressed about money or work. Maybe he was having health problems he hadn't told us about. There had to be some explanation that made sense. When I got home, Sarah was already there making dinner. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I sat down at the kitchen table and told her everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, but I could see she was getting more and more concerned. After I finished, she asked if I thought there might be any truth to what my dad had said. I told her that was impossible. I looked like both my parents, especially my mom. We had the same dark hair and brown eyes. Plus, my dad had always treated me like his son. Why would he do that if he knew I wasn't his biological kid? But Sarah pointed out that his reaction was so extreme and specific. She said people don't usually make up something like that when they're angry. They might call you names or say hurtful things, but claiming you're not their biological child seemed too detailed to be just rage talking. I spent the rest of the evening pacing around the apartment and trying to call my mom. She didn't answer her phone, which wasn't like her at all. I left 3 voicemails asking her to call me back and explain what had happened. I barely slept that night, just kept staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. The next morning, Sarah suggested I get a DNA test done. She said it was the only way to know for sure, and if my dad was wrong, I'd have proof to show him. I initially resisted the idea because it felt like I was betraying my family somehow. But she pointed out that my dad was the one who had brought it up in the first place. I finally agreed to do it, mainly just to prove that my dad had been talking nonsense. I found a lab online that could do paternity testing, and they said I could come in that afternoon. All I needed was a cheek swab, and they'd have results within a week. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. The lab technician was professional and didn't ask any questions about why I needed the test done. I gave them my dad's name and contact information, though I had no idea how I was going to get a sample from him. The technician explained that they could work with items like used drinking glasses or toothbrushes if necessary. That evening, I drove back to my parents' house. My dad's truck wasn't in the driveway, so I figured he was still at work. My mom answered the door, and she looked like she'd been crying. She invited me in, but she seemed nervous and kept glancing toward the garage like she expected my dad to come home any minute. I asked her what had happened the night before and why Dad had reacted that way. She said he'd been under a lot of stress lately and that I shouldn't take what he said seriously. But when I pressed her for more details, she got defensive and said she didn't want to talk about it. The week waiting for the DNA results was probably the longest week of my life. I tried to go about my normal routine at work, but I kept spacing out during meetings and making stupid mistakes on projects. Sarah was incredibly patient with me, but I could tell she was worried too. I had managed to get one of my dad's coffee mugs from their kitchen when my mom wasn't looking, so the lab had been able to extract DNA from that. They called me on a Friday afternoon and asked if I could come in to discuss the results in person. Something about the way the lab technician sounded made my stomach drop. Sarah offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. The lab was in a sterile office building downtown, and I sat in the waiting room for about 15 minutes before they called me back. The genetic counselor was a middle-aged woman who seemed kind but professional. She had a folder on her desk with my name on it. She asked me to sit down and explain that DNA paternity tests are extremely accurate. Then she opened the folder and showed me the results. The numbers didn't mean much to me, but the conclusion was clear. There was zero probability that the man I'd called Dad for 26 years was my biological father. I stared at the paper for a long time without saying anything. The counselor asked if I had any questions, but I couldn't think of any. She gave me copies of all the documentation and suggested I might want to consider genetic counseling to help process the information. I walked out of that office feeling completely numb. I sat in my car in the parking lot for probably 30 minutes, just looking at the DNA results. The paper had official letterhead and signatures, and all these technical details that proved my dad had been telling the truth. I wasn't his son. When I finally drove home, Sarah was waiting for me with dinner ready. She took one look at my face and knew what the results had shown. I handed her the papers without saying anything, and she read through them carefully. Then she sat down next to me on the couch and asked what I wanted to do next. I told her I needed to confront my mom and find out who my real father was. Sarah pointed out that this was going to be an incredibly difficult conversation and that my mom had probably been keeping this secret for decades. She suggested I think carefully about how I wanted to approach it. But I was past being careful. I felt like my entire life had been built on a lie, and I deserved to know the truth. I called my mom and told her I was coming over the next day to talk. She tried to ask what it was about, but I just said we needed to discuss what Dad had said the week before. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about all the times my dad had seemed distant or frustrated with me growing up. I'd always assumed it was just his personality, but now I wondered if he'd known the truth all along. Had he been raising me while knowing I wasn't his biological son? The thought made me feel sick. I decided to meet my mom at her workplace instead of going to the house. I figured she'd be less likely to get defensive or emotional in a public setting, and I wouldn't have to worry about my dad showing up. Her dental office was in a small professional building, and I waited in the parking lot until I saw her come out for her lunch break. She seemed surprised to see me there, but she agreed to sit in my car and talk. I could tell she was nervous because she kept fidgeting with her purse strap. I started by telling her I'd gotten a DNA test done, and I watched her face go completely pale. She immediately started denying everything before I even showed her the results. She said DNA tests weren't always accurate and that I shouldn't believe everything I read. But when I handed her the official paperwork, she went quiet and just stared at it for a long time. I asked her directly if my dad was my biological father. She kept trying to deflect and change the subject. She said it didn't matter and that family was about more than just genetics. She told me my dad had raised me and loved me, and that should be enough. But I wasn't going to let her avoid the question. I told her I deserved to know the truth about who I was and where I came from. I said the DNA results proved that my dad wasn't my biological father, and I needed to know who was. That's when she finally broke down. She started crying and admitted that she'd had an affair 27 years ago. She said it had only lasted a few months, and that she'd ended it when she found out she was pregnant. She'd convinced herself that the baby was my dad's because the timing could have worked either way. I asked her who my biological father was, but she said she couldn't tell me. She claimed it would destroy too many lives and that some secrets were better left buried. I got angry and told her that the secret was already destroying lives, starting with mine. She begged me not to pursue it any further. She said my biological father didn't even know I existed and that contacting him would be unfair to his family. But I told her that wasn't her decision to make anymore. I was an adult, and I had the right to know who my father was. Finally, after about an hour of back and forth, she told me his name was Michael Chun. She said he'd been a co-worker at her previous job and that they'd lost touch after she changed companies. She didn't know where he lived now, or even if he was still in the state. I asked if she had any way to contact him, and she said no. But something about the way she said it made me think she was lying. I pressed her on it, and eventually she admitted she still had some old letters and photos from when they were together. She'd kept them in a box in the basement all these years. She made me promise not to tell my dad that she'd told me the truth. She said he'd been suspicious for years, but had never been sure, and finding out for certain would probably end their marriage. I told her their marriage was built on a lie anyway, but she just started crying harder. It took me 3 weeks to track down Michael Chun. My mom finally gave me the box of old letters and photos, and I was able to piece together information about where he'd worked and lived back then. Through social media and some online searching, I found out he was now living about 2 states away and working as an accountant. I spent days trying to figure out how to contact him. Do you call someone out of the blue and tell them they might be your father? Do you send an email? I finally decided to send him a message through LinkedIn explaining that I was the son of someone he used to know and that I had some important information to share with him. He responded within a day, saying he remembered my mom and asking what this was about. I suggested we meet in person if possible, and surprisingly, he agreed. He said he had business in a city about halfway between us the following week, and we could meet there. The drive to meet him was nerve-wracking. I kept rehearsing what I was going to say, but nothing sounded right. How do you tell someone they're your father when they don't even know you exist? I got to the coffee shop early and sat there checking my phone every few minutes. When Michael walked in, I recognized him immediately from the old photos my mom had shown me. He was taller than I'd expected, but we had similar facial features and the same dark hair. He looked around the coffee shop until he spotted me, and I could see the recognition in his eyes too. We shook hands and made small talk for a few minutes while we ordered drinks. He seemed like a nice guy, quiet and thoughtful, kind of like me. Finally, I took a deep breath and told him why I'd wanted to meet. I explained about my mom and the affair, and how I'd recently discovered through DNA testing that my dad wasn't my biological father. His reaction was not what I'd expected. He went completely silent and just stared at me for probably 2 full minutes. Then he asked me to repeat my mom's full name and the dates when they'd been together. When I confirmed the details, he put his head in his hands and said he'd suspected something like this might be possible, but had never known for sure. He told me that he and my mom had been deeply in love, but that she was married and had ultimately chosen to stay with her husband. He said he'd moved away partly to make it easier for her to work on her marriage. He'd always wondered what would have happened if she'd left my dad, but he'd never tried to contact her again. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me photos of his own family. He'd been married for 20 years and had 2 daughters, ages 15 and 12. Looking at the pictures, I could see that his daughters and I shared some similar features. He said his wife knew about the affair, but thought it had ended without any consequences. We talked for almost 3 hours. He asked me about my life, my job, my girlfriend. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, but I could also tell he was overwhelmed by the whole situation. Finally, he said he needed some time to process everything and figure out how to tell his family about me. Epilogue asterisk. That was 2 months ago. Michael and I have been texting regularly, and we've met up twice more since then. He told his wife and daughters about me, and while it was difficult for them initially, they've been surprisingly welcoming. His youngest daughter even said she was excited to have a big brother. My relationship with my parents is still complicated. My mom and I are slowly rebuilding trust, but it's going to take time. My dad and I haven't spoken since that night in March. My mom says he's struggling with everything and isn't ready to talk yet. I'm hoping we can work things out eventually, because despite everything, he did raise me for 26 years. Sarah has been incredible through all of this. She says it doesn't change how she feels about me, and we're still planning our wedding for next spring. Michael has offered to walk me down the aisle if my dad isn't ready to do it, which means a lot to me. The weirdest part is that I feel like I understand myself better now. Some personality traits and interests that never quite made sense in the context of my dad's family suddenly click when I think about Michael's background. It's like puzzle pieces falling into place. I'm still processing everything, honestly. Finding out your entire identity was based on a lie is not something you get over quickly, but I'm grateful to finally know the truth, even though it's been painful. At least now I know who I really am.